China study presentation which aligns with Year 12 economics. My name is Mr. Ward and this video is recorded in October 2022. I want to stress this is an overview and you do need to do your own additional research. So which part of the economic syllabus are we covering, you ask? Well, in HSC Topic 1, the global economy, we need to undertake a case study. NESA states specifically, undertake a case study of the influences of globalisation on an economy other than Australia, including an evaluation of the strategies used to promote economic growth and development in this economy. Today's presentation is designed to provide a brief overview of China. You will need to do your own additional research, as I said. So a little about China before we get started. It should be noted that all of this information comes from the CIA Factbook. So where is China located? Well, it's located in East Asia. China is slightly smaller than Australia in physical size and is bordered by 14 countries. It has 14,500 kilometres coastline on the east. Due to its size, its climate is extremely diverse from the tropics in the south to subantarctic in the north. Similarly, the terrain is quite diverse. In the west, it is mostly mountains, while high plateaus and deserts. While in the east, it is plains, deltas and hills. Population. The population is 1.4 billion people as of 2022. This is the biggest country in the world by population. Overwhelmingly, the majority of the population is found in the eastern half of the country, while in the west, the vast mountainous and desert area remains sparsely populated. As such, it should be noted that although ranked 1 by population, its population density is not as high as some European or Asian countries. Capital city. The capital city is Beijing with a population of 21 million people, nearly the size of the total population of Australia. Although Beijing is the capital, it is not the biggest city by population. Rather, it is Shanghai with 28.5 million people. Median age. The median age is 38 years old, which is very similar to Australia, 37, and the United States of America, 38. The president of China is Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping became president in 2013. The South China Morning Post emphasises that his power comes not from being the president, rather as his position as a general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. Britannica goes on to describe the CCP as a monolithic and monopolistic party that dominates political life of China. It is the major policy-making body in China, and it sees that the central, provincial and local organs of government carry out those policies. Structure of government. According to Britannica, China has 33 administrative units directly under the central government. These consist of 22 provinces, 5 autonomous regions, 4 municipalities, including Beijing and Shanghai, and 2 special administration regions, including Hong Kong. Let's now have a look at the brief history of China. On the right is a great modern timeline from Pepperdine Libraries. I must admit, I got stuck down a rabbit hole with the history. It's important to have some context for the country we are studying, but you don't need to know all of what I'm about to talk about. So, the imperial era of China began in 221 BC and lasted until 1912 AD. During this period, according to the CIA Factbook, the country oscillated between periods of unity to disunity under the different dynasties. This all collapsed with the revolution in 1911, when the country became a republic, the Republic of China. However, this republic was beset by division, warlordism, and continued foreign intervention. As a result, in the 1920s, a civil war erupted lasting until 1949. During this period, Japan did occupy much of the northeastern parts of China in the 1930s and led to a full-scale invasion. Up to 20 million Chinese lives were lost by the time of Japan's defeat in 1945, at the end of World War II. When the Japanese did leave, the Civil War did continue and ended with the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP's, victory in 1949 under Mao. The country's name changed to the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. The CIA Factbook describes the period of Mao and the CCP as an autocratic socialist system while ensuring the PRC's sovereignty imposed strict controls over everyday life and launched agricultural, economic, political and social policies such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution that cost the lives of millions of people. A brief overview of the Great Leap Forward according to Investopedia. It was a 5-year economic plan executed by Mao and the CCP, which began in 1958 and abandoned in 1961. The goal was to modernise the country's agricultural sector using communist economic ideologies. Instead of stimulating the country's economy, the Great Leap Forward resulted in mass starvation and famine. It is estimated that between 30 and 45 million Chinese citizens died due to famine, execution and forced labour, along with massive economic and environmental destruction. The Great Leap Forward remains the largest episode of non-wartime mass killings in human history, and a clear example of the failures of socialist and economic central planning. While the New York Times provides a great summary of the Cultural Revolution as a movement which was fundamentally about elite politics, as Mao tried to reassert control by setting radical use against Communist Party hierarchy. But it had widespread consequences at all levels of society. Young people battled Mao's perceived enemies and one another as Red Guards before being sent to countrysides in the later stage of the Cultural Revolution. Intellectuals, people deemed class elites, and those with ties to the West or the former nationalist governments were persecuted. Many officials were purged. Some, like the future leader Deng Xiaoping, were eventually rehabilitated. Others were killed, committed suicide, or left permanently scarred. Some scholars contend that the trauma of the era contributed to economic transition in the decades that followed, as Chinese were willing to embrace market-oriented reforms to spur growth and ease deprivation. After Mao, subsequent leaders including Deng, Jiang and Hu focused on market-oriented economic development, opening up the country to foreign trade, while maintaining the rule of the CCP. Since this change, China has been among the world's fastest growing economies, with real gross domestic product averaging over 9% growth annually through to 2021, lifting an estimated 800 million people out of poverty and dramatically improving the overall living standards. So, we're now going to have a look at the strategies used to promote both economic growth and development in China. All after Mao in 1976, we'll look at these strategies, what they were, are, and how they operate, and the success of these strategies against both economic growth and development. However, often it's hard to identify specifically how a specific strategy improved economic growth and or development. As often it's a combination. As such, going through these strategies, I will look at economic growth and economic development changes overall. So the strategies I will look at are economic reform and opening up, joining the World Trade Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative or One Belt, One Road, free trade zones or special economic zones, and free trade agreements. Economic reform and opening up. First, some context. In 1978, after Mao's death, the top brass of Communist Party, the Centre Committee, had its third plenum to lift the country out of ruins. This involved a shift towards social market economy, with the ABC stating, Deng explicitly said that some people should be allowed to get rich first. In China Economic Reform and Opening at 40, the author notes the two elements were reform, meaning market-oriented economic reform at home, and opening, to economic and broader engagement with the outside world. Under reform, Deng encouraged bottom-up initiatives, for example, the household responsibility system. This replaced collective farming and made production the responsibility of households. It then tolerated small-scale private entrepreneurs, the author states, and it grew from there. A critical part of this was experimentation, which the ABC describes as start with something small, learn from that pilot program, and might have multiple iterations of the same pilot program all throughout the country. AsiaLink Business says China has what economists call a socialist market economy, one in which a dominant state-owned enterprise sector exists in parallel with market capitalism and private ownership. It was the active encouragement of private enterprise from 1978 that enabled China to kickstart the long expansionary boom that continues today. Private business now produces more than half of China's GDP and most of its export. They also create most new jobs. On the screen is a picture of Shanghai in 1990 and 2010, which clearly illustrates the economic reform post-1978. The economic reform and opening up post-1978 led to significant growth in urbanisation, shown in the graph on the right. Urbanisation, as defined by Britannica, is the process by which large numbers of people become permanently concentrated in relatively small areas forming cities. As New Geography notes, in 1980, the US urban population was 74% of the total. China's comparable figure was only 19%. Today, America's urban share of the population is more than 80%, whereas China's remains less than 50%. Taking into consideration China's colossal size and development level, the gap suggests extraordinary potential. In 2025, America will have 2 cities, New York and Los Angeles, with more than 10 million people. 3 with 5 to 10 million and 37 with more than a million. By then, China will have 5 cities with more than 10 million people, 9 with 5 to 10 million, and almost 130 cities with more than a million people. Viewed this way, China's urbanisation has barely begun. Now, this economic reform and opening up post-1978 did pave the way for some specific strategies, which we'll look at next. China joined the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in 2001. The WTO outlines its role as opening as a global system of trade rules, acting as a forum for negotiating trade agreements, and settling trade disputes between its members and supporting the needs of developing countries. According to a Princeton speech about China's WTO membership, it opens up China's market for more international trade and investment and opens the world economy for China's exports. It also notes that, symbolically, China's position in the world economy is openly recognised. The BBC notes that up until 2000, China's global economic role had been principally as one of the world's biggest manufacturers. It goes on to say, China's accession to the top table of the world trade hierarchy, a massive global transformation. A powerful combination of China's willing workforce, its super high-tech factories, and special relationship between the Chinese government and Western multinational corporations changed the face of the planet. It goes on to say that an army of cheap Chinese labour began to produce the goods that underpin Western living standards, as China seamlessly inserted itself into supply chains of the world's biggest companies, for example, Apple and Dell. In 2000, China was the 7th largest goods exporter in the world, but it quickly reached the number 1 spot. China's annual growth rate, already at 8%, went to the stratospheric at the height of the world boom, peaking at 14%. The infrastructure within China has also improved, with massive expansion of their highway network from 4,700 kilometres in 1997 to 161,000 kilometres by 2000. It does appear the WTO has been extremely beneficial for China. However, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the US House of Representatives, in a Twitter post on the 11th of December 2021 stated, 20 years ago, by granting the WTO membership, the world gave the Chinese Communist Party a blank check to break its market promise and cheat American workers, while exploiting its own workers. As I predicted then, this decision was an economic failure for our workers and a moral failure for our values. So obviously, not all are a fan of China joining the WTO. Our next strategy to improve economic growth and development is the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as One Belt, One Road. It is 2 parts, which Chatham House outlines as the Belt refers to plans for a revitalised series of ancient overland trading routes connecting Europe and Asia to be built largely with Chinese expertise, while the road is a new sea trade infrastructure along the old Marco Polo route, a maritime Silk Road connecting China, Southeast Asia, Africa and Europe. The Lowy Institute describes the Belt and Road Initiative as one of President Xi's most ambitious foreign and economic policies. It aims to strengthen Beijing's economic leadership through a vast program of infrastructure building throughout China's neighbouring region. It goes on to state, many foreign policy analysts view this initially largely through a geopolitical lens, seeing it as Beijing's attempt to gain political leverage over its neighbours. In addition, the Lobby Institute states the Chinese government also wants to use OBOR as a platform to address the country's chronic excess capacity. It is more about migrating surplus factories than dumping excess products. An Australian Parliament House research publication concluded supporters suggest that the initiative permits new infrastructure and economic aid to be provided to needy economies. Critics claim that it facilitates Chinese economic and strategic domination of the countries along these routes. While a Guardian report in 2018 estimates the cost to be over $1 trillion and raises serious concern that is a form of economic imperialism that gives China too much leverage over other countries, often those that are smaller and poorer. While a 2019 World Bank report has concluded that this initiative could speed up economic development and reduce poverty for dozens of developing countries, but it must be accompanied by deep policy reform that increase transparency, improves debt sustainability, and mitigate environmental, social, and corruption risks. Free Trade Zones, FTZs, also known as Special Economic Zones, started in 2013 as another strategy to promote economic growth and development. The Canadian government succinctly defines an FTZ as types of special economic zones where goods may be imported, handled, manufactured and exported without direct intervention from customs. It uses both tax and business incentives to attract foreign investment and technology. The Canadian government goes on to state that each FTZ in China has an industrial and economic focus, with different incentives to fulfill its objectives. These incentives and regulations for each FTZ align with the Chinese government's ongoing policy priorities. According to the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, in 2021, China's 21 FTZs contributed 17.3% of China's total foreign trade and 18.5% of China's foreign investment inflows. The first SEZ was Shanghai, established in 2013, with the intent of promoting international trade. There are now 21. China uses the FTZs to pilot new policies and regulations, thus permitting companies to experience more liberalised environments with potentially lighter regulation touch. Many international companies found FTZs an attractive option to set up China's operation depending on the industry. The Centre for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, emphasises that FTZs account for a significant proportion of Chinese foreign trade and investment. It goes on to emphasise that through the first 7 months of 2020, China's FTZ contributed $400 billion in foreign trade, 13.5% of China's total, and attracted more than 3,300 new foreign enterprises, accounting for $13.3 billion in foreign investment, 16.8% of China's total. CSIS goes on to state that China's aspirational objective to establish self-sufficient technological supply chains became a global leader in the digital economy, and transition from low to high value-added manufacturing are apparent in the structure of China's newest FTZs. Free trade agreements. Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade defines a free trade agreement as treaties between two or more countries designed to reduce or eliminate certain barriers to trade and investment and to facilitate stronger trade and commercial ties between participating countries. China has bilateral investment agreements with over 100 countries and economies. According to the Ministry of Commerce, People's Republic of China website, there are 22 free trade agreements with China. Australia has 15 for some comparison. 10 free trade agreements under negotiation, 8 more under consideration, and 1 preferential trade agreement. A 2020 paper titled Who Benefits of Trade with China concluded that China is the main beneficiary from the free trade agreements, particularly with Western countries. It goes on stating there is a positive correlation to an increase in overall trade, export, and import. It should be noted this is based on a sample of 27 countries trading with China. Adesin Schreier Associates, a global law firm, emphasised the importance of one of these FTAs, the ASEAN-China Free Trade Area. This is the largest free trade area in terms of population and the third largest in terms of nominal GDP after the European and NAFTA. The original FTA reduced tariffs on nearly 8,000 products categories, or 90% of imported goods, to zero. For China, the average tariff rate on Chinese goods exported to the ASEAN bloc fell to just 0.6%, down from 12.8%. The tariff rate on ASEAN goods exported to China also fell from 9.8% to 0.1%. So, how successful have these strategies been for China overall? We can have a look at this in two lenses: economic growth and economic development. Let's start with economic growth. Dixon 2022 defines economic growth as an increase in the volume of goods and services that an economy produces over a period of time. It is measured by the annual rate of change in real gross domestic product GDP, that is percentage increase year on year, adjusted for inflation. Economic growth increases because of two reasons, according to an RBA explainer. One, increase in economic aggregate demand, that is a total level of spending in the economy, so C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and increase in aggregate supply, that is the total outcome of goods and services in the economy. This is a result of increased labour, capital, and or productivity. On the screen is the annual GDP growth rate for China from 1971 to 2021 from the World Bank. Let's be honest here, the GDP growth is a tad like a roller coaster in the beginning. In the late 1970s, it fluctuated significantly from 8% to 0.1% year on year. In the 1980s, it improved, but still some level of fluctuation, but not as much. Then, from the 1990s to 2000, it grew, but the rate of growth slowed down from 14% in 1990 to just 7.7% in 2000. This continued to increase to a peak of 14.2% in 2007, and once it continued to grow through, though at a decreasing rate. When COVID hit, the economy grew, but just at 2%. It has subsequently bounced back to 8%. The World Bank note the following in a 2022 report. Since China began to open up and reform its economy in 1978, GDP growth has averaged over 9% a year, and more than 800 million people have been lifted themselves out of poverty. There's also been significant improvements in access to health, education, and other services over the same period. It then goes on to say, China's high growth based on investment, low-cost manufacturing, and exports has largely reached its limits and has led to economic, social, and environmental imbalances. Reducing these imbalances requires a shift in the structure of the economy, from manufacturing to high-value services, from investment to consumption, and from high to low carbon intensity. It then goes on to say, over the past few years, growth has moderated in the face of structural constraints, including declining labour force growth, diminishing returns to investment, and slowing productivity growth. These challenges going forward is to find new drivers of growth while addressing the social and environmental legacies of China's previous development path. Now, according to the CIA Factbook, let's look at some key components. So GDP composition by sector of origin, agriculture is about 8%, industry is about 40%, while services is 51%. While GDP composition by end use, household consumption is about 40%, government consumption is about 15%, investment in fixed capital is 42%, investment in inventories is only 2%, exports and goods and services is 20%, while imports of goods and services is 18%. While its labour force by occupation, about 27% work in agriculture, about 29% in industry, and about 44% work in the services. On the supply side, an IMF report concluded that a sharp, sustained increase in productivity, that is increased worker efficiency, was a driving force behind the economic boom. During the 1979 to 94, production gains accounted for more than 42% of China's growth, and by the early 1990s had overtaken capital as the most significant source of that growth. This increase of productivity, according to South China Morning Post, is due to reforms that have allowed the private sector to play a greater role in the economy. And economic development. Well, Dixon 2023 also defines economic development as a broad measure of welfare in a nation that includes health, education, and environmental quality, as well as material living standards. It is a multidimensional concept which is quite subjective and therefore it has no single measure. That being said, the most commonly used measure is a Human Development Index, HDI, developed by the United Nations. The HDI is a value between 0 and 1, comprising of 3 dimensions: long and healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. For each dimension, there is measurements: life expectancy at birth, expected years and mean years of schooling, and GNI per capita. A UN report of China's HDI published in 2019 notes, China's HDI value from 2019 is 0.761, which puts the country in the high human development category, positioning it at 85 out of 189 countries and territories. Between 1990 and 2019, China's HDI value increased from 0.499 to 0.761, an increase of 52.5%. Between 1990 and 2019, China's life expectancy at birth increased by 7.8 years, mean years of schooling increased by 3.2 years, and expected years of schooling increased by 5.2 years. China's GNI per capita increased by about 993% between 1990 and 2019. The HDI can be useful for comparison between 2 or more countries. For instance, during the period between 1990 and 2019, China, Vietnam, and Indonesia experienced different degrees of progress towards increasing their HDIs. China's 2019 HDI of 0.761 is above the average of 0.753 for countries in the high human development group, and above the average of 0.747 for countries in East Asia and the Pacific. From East Asia and the Pacific, China is compared with Indonesia and Vietnam, which have HDIs ranked of 107 and 117 respectively. Another measure of economic development is the proportion of people living on less than $2 per day. 40 years ago, 88% of the population. Now it's just 6% of the population, according to the ABC. Now that's quite an achievement. However, there are concerns about economic development as a result of economic growth. The CIA Factbook notes the growth has created considerable social displacement and adversely affected the country's environment and reduced the country's natural resources. 2. The huge increase in the size of the middle class has resulted in greater electricity generation. This has resulted in poor air quality in some areas. The US Embassy website has estimated 1.24 million people have died from exposure to air pollution in the PRC in 2017. While a 2014 paper focused on the impact of the open door policy concluded that although the reforms post-1978 accelerated growth in China, it led to developed cities experiencing hypergrowth, but developing cities are left behind. This has significantly influenced income inequality in China. The author goes on to say that the government is now focused on reducing the income gap of urban and urban as well as urban and rural. China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, or CHAFTA. Now, there's nothing like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. While talking about China, it's a great opportunity to talk about the Free Trade Agreement FTA Australia has with China, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, or CHAFTA. This is part of the HSC Topic 2 when we look at Australia's free trade agreements. CHAFTA was entered into force in December 2015. DFAT promotes this agreement as unlocking significant opportunity for Australia in China, which is Australia's largest export market for goods and services, accounting for nearly a third of total exports and a growing source of foreign investment. Some of the key elements of CHAFTA by industry include agriculture. China is Australia's largest agriculture export base. It is worth about $13 billion and provides Australia with an advantage over our major agricultural competitors, including the United States, Canada, and the European Union. There will be the elimination of the remaining tariffs on barley and sorghum by 2015 and reduce tariffs for dairy, beef, wine and wool up to 20%, progressively up to 2026. Energy. Once again, China is the biggest export base for energy, accounting for $85 billion. Key outcomes include 0 tariffs on iron ore, gold, crude petroleum and LNG, which provides certainty for our exporters. Services. Surprise, surprise, China is Australia's largest export for services at a value of $15 billion. CHAFTA improves access for banks, insurers, law firms, and professional services, suppliers, education, service exporters, as well as health, aged care, and construction, manufacturing, and telecommunication services. Investment. CHAFTA improves opportunities for investors in both countries. China's commitments on investing in CHAFTA protects the competitive advantage of Australia's businesses in China into the future. Increasing numbers of Australian businesses are entering the Chinese market with greater success, with banking and wealth management the leading sector of Australia's direct investment in China. And labour mobility. CHAFTA supports increased trade and investment between Australia and China by reducing barriers to labour mobility and improving temporary access with the context of each country's existing immigration and employment framework and safeguards. Now, the information from the slide before all comes from DFAT, which negotiated CHAFTA, so focuses more on the positives. Now, some advantages of CHAFTA are just basic economics. There are cheaper goods and services for both countries with the removal of tariffs, which both improves the quality and quantity of goods and thus improves living standards and puts downward pressure on inflation. Furthermore, it provides certainties for some industries such as iron ore and coal. This is great for Australia's biggest export good, iron ore, and those employees in those industries, and those who own shares in the companies too, such as BHP benefit. A Sydney Morning Herald article titled CHAFTA, Not Just About Economics, is about Australia and Asia from 2015 notes. When CHAFTA entered into force, 85% of Australia's export to China will enter duty-free. Once the agreement comes fully into effect, 95% of Australia's exports will enter duty-free. It is the most important development in our campaign to engage meaningfully with our region. Though, a separate Sydney Morning Herald investigation titled CHAFTA has opened doors to unqualified workers in 2016. In one specific instance, Chinese workers agreed to work for less than $10 an hour, a sum that is illegal in Australia, but more than double the average wage paid in China for 6 days a week. The concerns of SMH is that immigrant workers are being exploited and it undermines the economic fabric of the country. While concerns raised by the ABC in a 2015 article titled China-Australia's Free Trade Agreement, Pros and Cons, raised the concern that the threshold for foreign investment review board screening of Chinese investment is non-sensitive sectors, i.e. excludes agriculture, metal, telcos and defence, rise from $252 million to $1 billion. Therefore, it can be seen that CHAFTA is not a perfect FTA, and as such, there are winners and losers. However, in general, consumers are benefiting from reduced cost. Up on screen now is my reference list, and I encourage you to pause the presentation here and view them in your own time. And ladies and gentlemen, that is my video in China. As I said, this is just an overview, and I encourage you to do your own additional research.